From Oligarchy to Tyranny, documentary by Elizabeth Remini. If you've ever tried to understand for yourself how Hitler came to power, you've probably read a lot of passive sentences like, the governments fell, there was instability, an economic crisis was created, as if all this happened as a stroke of fate. On the other hand, you may have read a review of Hitler's biography, as if he alone created himself and made himself the dictator of Germany. But it is not always clear what caused all these things and what made them possible. To understand the processes that brought Hitler to power, it is important to first understand what kind of democracy was the Weimar Republic, where he came to power. The Weimar Republic was established on the ruins of the militaristic German Empire at the end of the First World War. Towards the end of the war in March 1918, the Soviet Union, which had just been established following the Bolshevik Revolution, withdrew from the war. Her retirement breathed a spirit of optimism into the ranks of the Germans, and allowed them to divert forces from the Eastern Front and concentrate them on the Western Front. This change allowed the Germans to launch in March 1918 the so-called Spring Offensive, in which they bet all their chips. This offensive brought the Germans many achievements, including an advance of 60 kilometers and reaching within artillery range of the suburbs of Paris. The German generals echoed these achievements to the German public. What they did not tell the German public was that the success came at a heavy price. The German force was worn to the bone and was left quite helpless. At the same time, fresh and well-equipped American and Canadian forces arrived in the campaign, among other things with the revolutionary innovation tanks, and began to beat the Germans in one defeat after the other. The German generals, who were an important part of the ruling class in the German Empire, understood that total defeat was inevitable. Commanders of the army, Generals Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, made it clear to Kaiser Wilhelm II that the situation of the army was dire, and an armistice must be requested immediately to prevent a disaster for Germany. A republic born by Caesarean section. But they were not ready to admit defeat. The commander of the army and de facto ruler of Germany, General Erich Ludendorff, advised Kaiser Wilhelm II to replace the government. Establish a new government that would consist of the democratic parties and charge it with negotiating the surrender, so that the blame for the defeat would not be placed on the leadership of the army, but on the politicians of the new government. The advice charmed the Kaiser, and he acted just like that. The commander of the American forces, General John Pershing, objected to accepting the Germans' proposal for an armistice, and wanted to take advantage of the situation to overwhelm the Germans and hold a victory parade in Berlin. But the leaders of the consenting countries that fought the Germans were tired of war and agreed to accept the proposal as long as the fighting ends. But a few days before the armistice came into effect, a revolution took place in various cities in Germany, called the November Revolution, which led to the abdication of the Kaiser and his escape to the Netherlands, and the establishment of a republican regime. It so happened that the German people, who were convinced that they were facing a tremendous victory, were informed that the social democratic government, which had just been established, had surrendered. And all this despite the fact that German forces still held the territories of devastated France, while not a single chicken coop was damaged in German territory. Even Germany's new social democratic chancellor, Friedrich Ebert, hailed the soldiers who returned from the battlefield invincible. The Kaiser did not manage to keep his crown, but as a result of this lie, on the basis of which the Republic was founded, the leaders of the army, most of whom also belonged to the aristocracy, maintained their status, prestige, and influence. Note the prefix von to the family name, which indicates an aristocratic lineage. This was not the only lie spread in Germany at the time. Contrary to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany continued to produce tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons. They did this starting in 1921 in the territory of Russia, in cooperation with the Soviets, then led by Lenin. They also did this without considering the burden that this investment placed on the German economy, which had already begun to falter during the war. Germany never complied with the payment of the reparations imposed on it, nor did it intend to comply, but its ruling class used it as an excuse for its difficult economic situation, even though this was not its reason. To add to the traumatic manner in which the Weimar Republic was created in January 1919, there was an uprising attempted by a group of extreme Marxists called Spartacists led by Karl Liebknecht and the Jewess Rosa Luxemburg. This attempt was suppressed by force by units of the army and the Freikorps militia, volunteer units from army veterans mobilized for nationalist motives. Liebknecht and Luxemburg were murdered by the men of the Freikorps units. In Bavaria, during the November Revolution, the Jewish socialist Kurt Eisner declared an independent socialist state under his leadership. Eisner himself was murdered in February 1919 by an anti-Semitic noble officer, whose mother, paradoxically, was of Jewish origin. In April, his successors announced the establishment of a Soviet republic in Bavaria, which was replaced within 6 days by a communist government. Here, too, this government was eliminated in May 1919 by members of the Freikorps militia and regular forces of the army in street battles that claimed the lives of many hundreds on both sides. The Bolshevik Revolution that led to the annihilation of the Russian aristocracy was fresh in the memory of the German elite, and the communist coup attempts only raised the level of anxiety. The fact that it was the army that eliminated these coups increased its political importance, and this, of course, while the prestige of its commanders was not damaged by the defeat in the First World War. By the way, the coup attempts I described were only the most prominent. There were more, and they were also eliminated by the army. To remind you, a democratic regime depends on the free flow of information. But one of the characteristics of the Germans is their willingness to lie to themselves. At the time, no one really revealed to the German people the extent of the defeat they actually suffered in the First World War. The deep state. Despite all the revolutions, the transition from a militaristic empire to a quasi-republic was made fairly smoothly. Germany did receive a new constitution, the draft of which was written by the Jewish lawyer Hugo Frois in his capacity as Minister of the Interior, and approved with changes. But entire institutional structures remained unchanged. For example, the Supreme Court, the Reichsgericht, which was founded back in 1879, continued to exist continuously until the end of World War II. The president of this court at the time of the founding of the Republic, Rudolf von Seckendorf, was appointed to his position on June 18, 1905 during the imperial period, and finished his position only on January 1, 1920 during the Republic period, at the age of 75. And another important example, the central bank, the Reichsbank, was founded back in 1876, and it also continued to exist until the end of World War II. The president of the Reichsbank, Rudolf Havenstein, who was appointed as early as 1908, continued in office continuously until his death in November 1923. Havenstein was responsible for both the creation of German bonds during World War I and the unlimited printing of paper money, which created the hyperinflation of Germany during the Republic. A topic I will address in the next chapter. The army. The Reichswehr, despite its name change, was a continuation of the Imperial Army, and it maintained its independence and was not subject to the Parliament, the Reichstag, nor to the government, but to the President of the Republic, and was in fact a state within a state. This status was guaranteed by the Ebert-Gruner Pact, signed between Friedrich Ebert, the first Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, and General Wilhelm Gruner, who replaced Erich Ludendorff in command of the Imperial Army. The agreement, which was initially secret, was concluded on November 10, 1918, one day after Ebert came to power. In the agreement, Gruner promised to Ebert the loyalty of the army, and in return it was agreed on the suppression of the communist uprisings in order to restore public order and, as stated above, the status of the army as a state within a state would be preserved. The agreement, which, after it was published, was severely criticized by Ebert's colleagues from the socialist parties, basically resulted in all the governments of the Weimar Republic being dependent on the goodwill of the military. The next commander of the army, Hans von Zecht, has already allowed himself to disobey orders he received from the civilian echelon. The most prominent example was during the Kapp Putsch, where the Freikorps units of the army, which were supposed to be disbanded according to the Treaty of Versailles, marched to Berlin and seized power. The army refused Ebert's demand to act against them. The putsch failed only after the government called a general strike. After his military service ended, von Zecht joined politics and was a delegate to the Reichstag on behalf of the German People's Party DVP, which was totally opposed to the Treaty of Versailles. And you thought that generals moving from the army to politics was an Israeli invention. As part of the ability to lie to themselves, the Germans continued to call themselves a republic, although in practice the leaders of the military and the wealthy aristocracy continued to control German politics. They did so through the army, through non-political bureaucratic institutions, and through incompetent politicians whom they tried to control, not always with success, and mostly while creating instability. The man who must be toppled. Friedrich Ebert, leader of the Social Democratic Party, SPD, was the tragic figure in this story. On the one hand, he aspired to create a democratic republic, but on the other hand, he had to maintain the stability of the country against the frequent revolution attempts and to allow recovery from the results of the war. In the first direct democratic presidential elections in February 1919, he was elected by the German people as president of the republic. But precisely because of his attempt to please both sides in order to overcome the crisis, he remained hated both by the communists and the extreme left, and by the loyalists of the empire, the old oligarchy. Ebert became the target of attacks from both the right and the left, but the attacks from the right, from the deep state, were the most difficult and decisive. The attacks included slander and total ridicule in the press. They called him a traitor. The justice system worked against him, and he had to defend himself in a court that was loyal to the oligarchy. Ebert also suffered from health problems. Remember, this was the era before antibiotics, and these together with his legal battles overwhelmed him, and he died at the age of 54. And so, in 1925, the way was opened for the appointment of the oligarchy's loyalist Paul von Hindenburg as president of the Republic. As you may recall, Hindenburg was the chief of staff of the German army in World War I alongside Ludendorff. It is important to note that the role of the president in the Weimar Republic was not symbolic at all, even though it was not a full presidential regime like in the United States. And what happened to his partner in the leadership of the army, the other chief of staff Erich Ludendorff? Well, after spreading the fake news that Germany could have won the war, but the Jews stuck a knife in its back, he discovered Hitler. In 1923, Ludendorff participated in the failed putsch in the beer cellar that Hitler attempted, and thus, thanks to the patronage of the beloved former chief of staff, Hitler turned from an unknown eccentric into a well-known public figure. Hitler spent a symbolic period in prison for the putsch, although according to the law, he was subject to the death penalty. Ludendorff, not even that. He was acquitted. Oh well, he came from the right place. A former chief of staff who organizes a putsch. It's the economy. As mentioned before, the condition of the German economy began to deteriorate during the World War, and not as a result of the payment of reparations which never materialized as stipulated. The high inflation was due, among other things, to the fact that during the war, the German government refused to finance the war from tax increases, and instead used bonds. To raise the huge sums, it was necessary to entice many potential buyers, and the way to do this was of course to offer a high interest rate on the bonds. The payment of interest and the redemption of these bonds at maturity caused the need to print a lot of money, resulting in hyperinflation. The printing of money could be reduced by cutting expenses, but go cut the expenses of the army when it is independent and you depend on it. This is an inflation that even in Israel in the 1980s it was impossible to imagine anything similar to it. The price of a loaf of bread reached 200 billion marks in 1923. Inflation, and the consequent weakening of the value of the mark relative to other currencies, actually played to the benefit of German industry, whose exports were cheap, and consequently also to the benefit of the industrialists, but severely harmed the public. Inflation, high interest rates, and a state treasury that is always in deficit and thirsty for cash are means to block social mobility. Talented young people in such a situation will find it difficult to raise capital for establishing new businesses, and as employees, their salary and savings will always be eroded. While the wealthy can increase their wealth by providing risk-free high-interest loans to the state treasury. Following the global economic crisis that erupted following the fall of the American stock market on October 24, 1929, the economic situation in Germany worsened. And in March 1930s, the last social democratic government of Weimar Germany fell. The leaders of the oligarchy began to take advantage of the crisis to increase their grip on power independently of the Reichstag, which was the German parliament. They knew they could trust Hindenburg. He was one of them. Hindenburg appointed Heinrich Brüning as chancellor. Brüning saw eye to eye with the army leaders, the goal of returning Germany to the status of a superpower, and did not spare investments in armaments. Again, contrary to the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War. To finance the expenses, he also raised taxes and cut government expenses of social nature. The result of this policy was a worsening of the economic situation. This situation drew vigorous protests. The communists and the Nazis took advantage of it to form militias that started fighting each other in the streets. Since the chaos served the army leaders and some of the law enforcement personnel, who were also part of the same oligarchy, which was not interested in the continued existence of a democratic republic, they refrained from using enforcement measures, which were required to restore order, and of course they did not outlaw the militias either. The SA, for example, took part in the beer cellar putsch attempt in collaboration with Ludendorff in 1923. So there were more than enough legal grounds to outlaw it, and it was indeed outlawed, but only for a short time. Remember how the army acted against the leftist uprisings? Could it be that this was selective enforcement? All this caused Brüning to lose his coalition majority in the Reichstag. But he continued to hold his position. How? President Hindenburg invoked Article 48 of the Constitution, declaring a state of emergency. Brüning and his government continued to operate under the emergency orders. A government that continues to serve without a coalition majority. Didn't I hear about such a democratic idea in 2022? And what was the reason for the inclusion of Article 48 in the Constitution of the Republic in the first place? Well, remember the Jewish lawyer Hugo Preuss, who came up with this constitution? He believed that this clause was essential as a precautionary measure against the danger of the tyranny of the majority. Brüning made another attempt to regain the coalition majority again, through Hindenburg, who dissolved the Reichstag and called for elections. The difficult economic situation, inflation, and increasing unemployment, along with riots in the streets, strengthened the extreme parties, and in the elections held on September 14, 1930s, the Communists won 77 seats in the Reichstag, and the Nazis 107 seats out of 507 seats. This did not give Brüning a coalition majority, but it did not prevent him from continuing to serve his masters, the army leaders and the anti-republican aristocracy in the position of chancellor until the end of May 1932. I hope you are already beginning to understand that this is not really a democracy. And while the economy continued to deteriorate and unemployment increased, while unemployment benefits were cut, the Junkers, junior-level aristocrats, who were landowners and industrialists, continued to enjoy subsidies for their estates, and the budgets for the military continued to flow. The Minister of Defense, the liaison to the army in this government, was none other than Wilhelm Groener, remembered from the Ebert-Groener Pact. Just not. Other actions that Brüning did to the delight of his elite operators concerned foreign relations. Brüning continued to dissolve the Treaty of Versailles, but not sufficiently. They were not satisfied that Brüning had not succeeded in getting all the restrictions on the German army under the Treaty of Versailles to be lifted. And first and foremost, they wanted to lift the ban on conscription. It was urgent for them, because the trained reserve soldiers who participated in the First World War began to reach retirement age. This was the reason for Brüning's replacement by Chancellors Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher. One of the reasons for the inability of the opponents of the Nazis, and they were the majority, to act unitedly against them was the division and mutual boycotts. The murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht by the Freikorps during the suppression of the Spartacist rebellion poisoned the relationship between the Communist and Social Democratic parties. The Communists considered the Social Democrats, who were in power at the time, responsible for the murder. Later, it was Stalin in 1928 who ordered the German Communists to concentrate their struggle and opposition against the Social Democrats, and not against the Nazis. The left from the left to the left. The Social Democrats themselves proved dangerously naive when they continued to blindly trust the Weimar Constitution and the legalistic norms of the ruling elite, and turned to the mechanisms of the state, including the police and the army, even though they knew that these were exactly the same mechanisms of the imperial militaristic regime, most of which opposed the Republic. Civil disobedience. To prevent the possibility of the return to power of the Social Democrats, who were still the largest party in the Reichstag, the military encouraged the right-wing militias. Primarily the Nazis as A, the Storm Division, the Brown Shirts, and the SS, the Black Shirts. These organizations were outlawed in the state of Prussia, which was the largest state in the states of the Weimar Republic, and included Berlin, and which was still under social democratic rule. In fact, Brüning also tried to act against the militias, and this was another factor that convinced the generals in Hindenburg that he should be replaced. The Nazi militias rioted and blew up election meetings of competing parties, terrorized opponents of Nazism, and even murdered some of them. The fact that law enforcement did not act against them encouraged many to join them. Many of the former Freikorps militias, which were disbanded, and who were unemployed due to the high unemployment rate in Germany as a result of the economic crisis, joined to the SA militias and the SSS. After the chancellor who replaced Brüning, Franz von Papen, bypassed the Prussian government and lifted the ban on the Nazi SA, riots began in Prussia, and especially on what became known as Bloody Sunday in Altona on July 17, 1932. Although such riots were not unusual in other German states as well, von Papen took advantage of this situation to carry out what became known as the Prussian coup, Prussienschlag. On July 20, he published a decree prepared in advance and signed by President von Hindenburg, which effectively cancels the autonomy of the state of Prussia, transfers the powers of the Prussian government to von Papen himself, and authorizes the Reichswehr to enforce the decree, Article 48 again. On July 21, a petition was submitted to the Supreme Court of the Weimar Republic, the Reichsgericht, by the Prussian government, parties from the Prussian parliament, and in addition by the governments of Bavaria and Baden. The Supreme Court refused the request for a preliminary injunction that would stop von Papen's steps. After further deliberations, the Supreme Court in its meandering ruling partially vindicated both sides, but determined that the Prussian government's override was illegal, and that there was a violation of the Constitution. Despite this, the court succumbed to the facts created on the ground, did not cancel them, and did not accuse von Papen of anything. This ruling of the Supreme Court, which actually permitted the violation of the Constitution, was a critical milestone in the disintegration of the Constitution of the Weimar Republic. And it was understood this way by historians and commentators both in real time and, of course, in retrospect. The abolition of the autonomy of the Prussian state increased the centralization of the government, and thus later made it easier for Hitler to take control of all of Germany. While the court was debating, and especially after the publication of the ruling, von Papen continued his moves to purge the governing administration in Prussia of the supporters of the Republic, and to appoint people like him who aspired to return Germany to monarchy. As part of the Prussian coup, von Papen brought about the arrest of the Jewish deputy commander of the criminal police of Berlin, Bernhard Weiss, who tried to act against the Brown Shirts and other Nazis, and even filed libel suits against Joseph Goebbels. Weiss was arrested along with other police chiefs, and they were released a day later, after pledging to refrain from engaging in official activities. Militias breaking law and order that enjoy the protection of the authorities, I'm sure I've heard about it once. And not only in Hebrew, I think even in English with an American accent. Von Pappen's successor, von Schleicher, still tried to convince Hindenburg to declare the Communist Party and the Nazi Party illegal, but he refused. In March 1932, with a second round in April, German presidential elections were held. Hitler contested them for the position. He was sure that he is about to win, but he was far from winning. The German public preferred a sick and demented 85-year-old man over Hitler. Von Hindenburg was elected for another term. Hitler received only 36% of the votes. The third candidate was a communist. The Germans saw Hindenburg as the centrist candidate, even though he was completely biased on the side of the monarchists. If Hitler had won these elections, it could allegedly be argued that Hitler came to power democratically, since the very undemocratic powers that the president held would have been handed directly to him. But an absolute majority of the German people did not want him. Less than 10 months later, he was appointed chancellor. Who wants a coalition? In the Reichstag elections held at the end of July 1932, the Nazi Party won 230 seats out of 608 and became the largest party in the Reichstag. In addition, according to the results of these elections, for the first time there was not even a theoretical possibility to form a center-left government, but only a center-right government. Not that this coalition consideration was any factor in determining the identity of the chancellor, which was subject to the president's decision. The multiplicity of parties in the Reichstag required a lot of compromises in order to be able to maintain a coalition, and the ruling class, which from the outset was not interested in democracy, had no interest in compromising. The Nazis weren't known as compromise advocates either, and the communists weren't ready for the least of their full lust. After the elections, Hermann Göring was appointed the chairman of the Reichstag. This did not prevent von Papen from continuing as chancellor, until on September 12, he had to ask the president to dissolve the Reichstag in order to bring about elections to avoid embarrassment. After the communists submitted a motion of no confidence, and it became clear that the Nazis also intended to vote for it, Hitler was sure that his power was increasing from election to election, so he wanted more elections. However, in the elections held on November 6, 1932, which were the last somewhat fair elections in Weimar Germany, the Nazis were disappointed. Their power decreased from 230 to 196 seats, while the Communists' power increased slightly from 89 to 100 seats. Theoretically, a left-center coalition could be formed again, but you already understand that this is just a philosophical quibble. In any case, it can be said that sympathy for the Nazis began to wane in Germany. The coffers of the Nazi Party were also deflated after a presidential election and 3 Reichstag elections, and it was about to collapse. But the internal intrigues in German politics were about to turn defeat into victory. In December 1932, the German president replaced the chancellor and appointed von Schleicher, who continued to serve until the end of January 1933. But von Papen, whom von Schleicher had replaced as chancellor, undermined him. Von Papen was sure that Hitler was his buddy, and that he would be able to overrule him being vice-chancellor and having 8 ministers in the cabinet, while the Nazis will have only 3. And thus run Germany while Hitler was chancellor in title only. And so, with the help of the president's son, Oskar von Hindenburg, who was an ardent supporter of the Nazi Party, he brought about that the elderly von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. Hindenburg, of course, did not break any law by appointing Hitler as chancellor. Not yet. But is this really a democratic appointment? It certainly did not express the will of the people. The fact is that even under conditions of absolute coercion, still the absolute majority of the German people did not support the Nazis, as you will see next in the chapter The Fourth Election. It was still possible to form a unity coalition of moderate rightists and moderate leftists, and there were also a few centrist parties, and as you may recall, it was also possible without a coalition. But the oligarchy pushed for extremism, thus preventing the establishment of a stable coalition using the just not method. Hitler, as we know, was not satisfied with little as having his autobiography state that he had once been a chancellor, which is all he would have achieved, if the political system of the Weimar Republic had remained as it was. He aspired to much more. Hitler knew that as easily as all his predecessors were replaced, he too could be replaced, especially in light of the fact that he was a foreigner as far as the ruling elite were concerned. Hitler's coalition would also have crumbled in a short time, but he did not build on it and fundamentally changed the system. The fourth election. As far as I know, the debate among historians about who really caused the Reichstag fire has not yet been resolved. In any case, whether it happened at the initiative of the Nazis or by chance, Hitler knew how to take full advantage of it. The fire in the Reichstag broke out on the night of February 27, 1933. That is, less than a month after Hitler's appointment, and a week before another election was to be held in Germany. Hitler declared a state of emergency and immediately signed Hindenburg, who at that time was already mentally exhausted, to put it mildly, on the Reichstag burning order. This decree was the first step to the abolition of the Weimar Republic, since it included the abolition of articles of the Constitution. And, as you probably remember, Germany at that time had a Supreme Court, the Reichsgericht, which could abrogate this order, but its justices were also part of the ruling oligarchy, and they actually had pro-Nazi positions, and even applied racial laws in practice, even before those were enacted as part of the Nuremberg laws. The president of the Supreme Court at that time was Erwin Böhmke. Even before his appointment and before the Nazi Party was on the political map, Böhmke was a member of the German National People's Party, DNVP, which advocated nationalism and the renewal of the empire. A party in the House of Representatives that opposes the existence of the Republic. Excellent. What could go wrong? Rejected the Treaty of Versailles and was anti-Semitic. This was the party of the Junkers. How does such a person become the president of the Supreme Court? Böhmke was appointed to head the Reichsgericht by President Paul von Hindenburg in 1929. I don't think he was given a hearing in the Reichstag. What do you think? He continued in his position after the Nazis came to power, joined the Nazi Party in 1937, and even received badges of honor from the SS. Hitler himself extended his term, which ended on April 20, 1945, Hitler's birthday, due to his suicide 2 days before the arrival of the American army to Leipzig, the seat of the Supreme Court. And how do we know that this Supreme Court, the Reichsgericht, was entitled to cancel the decrees and laws that canceled the Constitution? Simple. The court itself ruled this in a judgment given on November 4, 1925. This is, of course, not the only evidence. There is also Article 13 of the Constitution, and more. The March 5, 1933 election was Hitler's last attempt to create a false representation of a supposedly democratic takeover of Germany. No, he did not expect the electorate to be enthusiastic about him due to his appointment as chancellor, and yet he brought about the dissolution of the Reichstag and the announcement of elections immediately after taking office. He built on extreme violence to be used by the SA gangs, the brown shirts, and the SS, which have now turned from pirate militias into an arm of the government. And they have indeed begun an unprecedented campaign of terror against all left and center parties. The Reichstag fire and the Reichstag burning order led to a worsening of the measures. Parties were closed, thousands of activists were arrested, including all the heads of the parties. And the people of the SA and SS also supervised the election process. Despite all this, the Nazis managed to obtain in these dubious elections only 288 seats and did not reach the 324 seats that were necessary to obtain absolute rule, as Hitler had hoped. From then on, they didn't even try to present a semblance of democracy. On March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act was passed in the Reichstag. The law transferred all legislative powers from the Reichstag to the government, and in practice to Hitler himself. You will be surprised, the Constitution actually allowed that. But to pass the law, a two-thirds majority was needed. You must be wondering how someone who doesn't have a simple majority could get two-thirds. Simple. To make sure in advance that the law had the required majority, the Nazis imprisoned 81 Reichstag delegates from the Communist Party. Additional delegates from the Social Democratic Party were forcibly held outside the Kroll Opera House, where the Reichstag convened, and in the building itself armed SA and SS men were walking around. The knives are drawn. This is how Hitler managed to eliminate the last remnants of a semblance of democracy and bring the Weimar Republic to an end. But there was still a risk that the one who would benefit from all this goodness would end up being someone else, because as you may recall, there is someone who can appoint and replace the Chancellor himself. And there is a whole ruling class behind him, which mainly includes the army. Hitler had to close this corner too. In addition, several people remained in the leadership of the SA, especially the head of the SA, Ernst Röhm, who saw themselves as partners in the grip of power as equal to Hitler himself. And they had proletarian views and values that arose from the socialist background of the National Socialist German Workers' Party NSDAP, which is the Nazi Party. These values were frowned upon by the ruling class, the aristocrats, the capitalists, the industrialists, and of course the military. In addition, the proletarian SA demanded to be merged into the army, which was based on the aristocracy. Unfortunately, the SA at that time numbered more people than the army itself. President Hindenburg was of course loyal to the army, and there was concern that in order to prevent the SA from taking over, he would decree military rule, and all of Hitler's achievements will fall into the hands of others. The former chancellors, Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher, also began to conspire behind the scene to return to their position. Hitler decided to sacrifice his accomplices in taking over Germany in order to win the sympathy of the army. On the night between June 29 and 30, 1934, a night known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler himself, with a gun in his hand, arrested Röhm. In a scene that could have been included in Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather film series. At the same time, the SS and the Gestapo arrested the entire SA leadership. Later, Hitler ordered executions without trial, and everyone was put against the wall and shot. On that occasion, accounts were settled with quite a few other opponents of Hitler from the past and present, including Kurt von Schleicher. Only von Papen's life was spared, since he was too close to Hindenburg. Thus, Hitler won the support of the army, and even the congratulations of President Hindenburg and the retired head of the Army General Werner von Blomberg, who was now the Minister of Defense. Even though among the murdered were some of their friends, such as the late von Schleicher. In the period that followed, Hitler was busy with internal affairs, and especially with deepening his control over Germany. While Hindenburg became ill, he enacted a law that united the functions of president and chancellor, and thus after Hindenburg's death, no other president was elected, which might have led to his replacement. In addition, he established branches of government such as the Gestapo, eliminated any possibility of political rivalry by banning political parties and revoking the independence of the states in the federation that still remained independent, and took control of the media and academia. Another thing that occupied him, as we know, was the Jewish subject, but at this point it was still on the back burner. As a side note, I will note that at the end of World War II, Very little was done to reverse this takeover and to purge the government, media, and academia of the people the Nazis have put in control there. The last chance. But Hitler owed the transformation of his rule into an irreversible fact precisely to his external enemies, the winning countries in the First World War. On March 7, 1936, German forces entered the Rhineland region on Hitler's orders. The Rhineland referred more or less to what are today the Rhineland and the Ruhrland. This area was important both strategically due to its location as a buffer, whose demilitarization protected France and its neighbors from a German attack, and due to its industrial capacity. In the Ruhr area, there were coal mines, 80% of all Germany's coal, and heavy industrial plants, the control of which opened up the possibility of strengthening the arms industry. For all these reasons, the entry of the German army into the Rhineland was prohibited according to Articles 42 and 43 of the Treaty of Versailles, a prohibition that was further strengthened according to Article 4 of the 1925 Locarno Treaty. Such a violation of these sections was of the highest seriousness. Entering the Rhineland was too bold even for the army commanders. The German army could afford to bring into the Rhineland only 22,000 soldiers out of the 32 divisions it had, which were not yet properly trained. The French alone at that time had 76 divisions, and the Belgians, who also bordered the Rhineland, had another 21 divisions. If the French had decided to act militarily against the German violation, the Czechs and the Romanians would have joined them, and perhaps even Poland. According to the Locarno Treaty, the English and Italians were also obliged to come to the aid of France. The German generals were cowering in fear, and Hitler promised them that if they saw even a hint of the beginning of organization for action on the part of the French, they would withdraw their forces from the Rhineland immediately. Hitler also later admitted that if the French had entered the Rhineland, the Germans would have been forced to retreat with their tails between their legs. For Hitler, it was an all-in bet. But the French and English were busy at the time appeasing the Germans and deluding themselves about the peace that Hitler had promised them. In addition to internal political struggles and general laxity of leadership, France itself was ruled by a transitional government at the time due to a political crisis. They did nothing. The abstention of the Western countries brought Hitler prestige and strengthened his control over Germany in general and the army in particular. The victory caused to forget the economic crisis that Germany was still suffering from at the time. The control of the industrial area started the process that eventually turned the balance of power between Germany and France. It encouraged Hitler and proved to him that he could fulfill his plan regarding the German living space, the Lebensraum. This was the point of no return, following which World War II became inevitable. If the French had removed Hitler from the Rhineland, it would have been a humiliation for him. His status would have been damaged. And it is not impossible that his regime would have come to an end as it began, not in a democratic way. In summary, bottom line, the Weimar Republic was a crippled democracy, if at all. In practice, it was an oligarchy. The oligarchy controlled the military, the court, the law enforcement systems, and the economic system. None of these systems have changed since Germany was a militaristic empire, as Otto von Bismarck built it, and Kaiser Wilhelm II continued to shape it. By the way, a republic that is actually controlled by an oligarchy is an ancient idea, actually dating back to the Roman Republic, where despite the plurality of votes, and the need for every official to be elected, in practice the aristocracy, which included the wealthiest patricians, controlled most of the positions. It was not similar at all to the democracy in ancient Athens. After it created chaos, with the help of lies and its control of the economy and of the law enforcement system, at a certain point, the German oligarchy, which yearned for its imperial period, got sick of the involvement of the people in government and began to eliminate it. Hitler simply took advantage of the weak points of the oligarchy and the intrigues that took place within it to finally turn Germany into a totalitarian dictatorship where he was at the helm.